This lesson will describe the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. First, let's start with primary sources. Primary sources are records of events or evidence that has first been described or has actually happened. Examples of primary sources might be a live news broadcast, a report on a new discovery such as an invention, or the sharing of new information. Other examples of primary sources might include handwritten letters, personal diaries, live interviews, and any first-hand account of information. Secondary sources represent the interpretation or the reporting of primary sources. Secondary sources summarize and interpret and analyze primary sources. Secondary sources include published sources such as books, newspapers, magazines, websites, academic journal articles that summarize and interpret information. In the previous example, I gave an example of a live news broadcast. A live news broadcast would be a primary source, but the 6 p.m. news would be considered a secondary source. Secondary sources add value by summarizing and interpreting primary sources. Tertiary sources represent a mix of both primary and secondary sources. They compile or further summarize primary and secondary sources. Tertiary sources are simply a repackaging of primary and secondary sources. Tertiary sources include dictionaries, encyclopedias, textbooks. Wikipedia is a perfect example of a tertiary source. Directories, guidebooks, manuals, handbooks, and most social media. A perfect example of a tertiary source would be a greatest hits or remix album that came from an original album. So an original live recording of music would be considered a primary source. A CD or a DVD or an album of music would be considered a secondary source, and a tertiary source would be a remix or a greatest hits album of that music. Typically speaking, primary sources can be found in museums and archives, while secondary and tertiary sources can be found in libraries. It's really important to note that a primary source is the original source of information. As an example, a primary source might be an original piece of art, but a secondary source would be the print, where there are millions of copies being printed and sold in stores. The tertiary source would be the redesigned Mona Lisa print that has vibrant colors. That concludes the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Thank you.